I think he was talking about the
Well, today we're going to start talking about the views of Paul in some detail. We've been discussing his conversion and some various other aspects, you might say, of the philosophical background. But today I want to really delve into, actually today and next time, two of the main issues that he's dealing with in Galatians and Romans. These are letters that were written during the 50s. The first of Paul's letters that we have is First Thessalonians, which can be dated quite precisely to 51 as a result of numismatic evidence, that is to say, bases on coins, and the luck of having a ruler who ruled only for 1 year, maybe 51. These were written shortly thereafter, so probably in the early 50s, Romans perhaps as late as around 60. In any case, there are two main issues that he's going to be focusing on. One is the question of justification, which we're going to be discussing in various ways throughout this course. And the other is the problem of weakness of will. So what I want to do today is concentrate on the latter problem. It's more philosophically familiar. It's something that we can use as a way of getting into the full significance of the first problem. Now, weakness of will. What do I mean by that? There are different ways of defining it. The rough idea is giving into temptation. Okay? So a simple, intuitive grasp of this is, yes, you're weak of will when you give in to temptation, when you know what you ought to do but not do it. And that's another characteristic. Know what you ought to do, but you don't do it. And the way that many philosophers have defined it, following actually the Roman poet Ovid, who defines it less than half a century before Paul, as knowing the better and doing the worse. Now, I'm not sure that any of these definitions is exactly what we want, but anything that's more precise is going to really get us into the realm of theory, and so for now, I think those are enough to give you the general idea. Okay, it's knowing the better, nevertheless doing the worse. Knowing what you ought to do but not doing, giving into temptation. Now, let's take some examples of this so that we have something clearly in mind. I think in philosophy it's always a very good idea to think about examples, concrete cases. Otherwise, it's very easy to get lost in abstractness. So let's think about some concrete cases of weakness of will. When is a person weak of will? When are they giving into temptation? Yeah?
Well, I know I need to do reading for class, but I watched the Super Bowl anyway.
Oh, perfect. You know you're supposed to do the reading for class, but instead you watch the Super Bowl. And even when the lights go out for 35 minutes, you nevertheless don't take the opportunity to read Romans, but nevertheless sit around waiting and finding out whether it really was some San Francisco fan who won the play. Yeah, in any case, that's one way example of weakness of will. So you know you're supposed to be doing work, but there's something you'd rather do, so you do that instead. That's a really common one for, I was about to say students, but actually professors and basically everyone I know. Other examples of weakness of will. Oh, come on. Yes?
Eating that third donut that you mentioned.
Eating that third donut. Okay, good. Now this is usually not explicitly a moral question, but notice there's something about this that really talks about morality. It could be an ought of prudence as well. So, for example, that third donut, yeah, somebody offers you this, and you think, well, that's awfully good, I know I shouldn't do it, but nevertheless you do it, right? There are things that for the sake of your own health you ought to do, but nevertheless you don't do them, you don't resist that donut. Yeah, actually, there was something like that faced me yesterday in addition to the Super Bowl problem. I had a day of weakness of will yesterday. So I get a call early in the morning saying, it's one of my rare days off. I was not playing music, but somebody called me right away and said, we just showed up and there's nobody here to set up anything. So I go scrambling. Within 10 minutes, I'm there. And actually, the guy who was supposed to set up showed up and scrambled. And I then done a little bit anyway, I helped. But then somebody brought donuts. And so it was a similar kind of thing. It's like, no, I shouldn't have that big apple fritter. But I love apple fritters. And it was really good and fresh from right across the street and so on and so forth. So, yes, that was a good example of giving into temptation. So it doesn't have to be a moral thing, right? It can be a prudential thing. I know what I ought to do to protect my health or to lose weight or whatever it is that I want, but nevertheless I don't do it. Other examples of things like this, yeah?
Sexual temptation in Christian tradition.
Okay, good. Sexual temptation. You might think, no, I have to resist this. But nevertheless, you give in because there's the temptation, it's attractive. Now notice what these examples have in common. Okay? What do they have in common? There's something, right, that tempts you, but then some reason you have for resisting. So can we generalize about this? I mean, what in these cases is the nature of the temptation? Yeah.
It's pleasurable.
Ah, good, it's pleasurable. So if we think, here you are, weighing things on a scale. Now this is, by the way, already somewhat theory-based. But we can think about this, and people have often thought about it in these terms. Here you are, weighing your options, okay? And you're thinking, which of these should I do? And on the one side is the temptation, right? It's the thing that is going to be held, yes, the sexual opportunity, or the donut, or the chance to watch the Super Bowl. This is typically something pleasurable. Can we say anything else about this?
Say things related to immediacy?
Yeah, it tends to be immediate. Good. This tends to be a short-term thing. It's immediate or relatively immediate, whereas often the payoff here, now this is presumably, this is the better thing, right? This is actually the better thing over here, but on the other hand, is it so pleasurable? The doing work, reading Romans, or resisting sexual temptation, or saying no to the donut. Is that so pleasurable? I mean, you say, apple fritter, I love apple fritters, but no, you then get this really pleasure. No, right? So it lacks this. In fact, often it's long-term, right? There's a long-term benefit, you think, to resisting that temptation, but the immediacy of the other thing is there. Yes?
There's another type of sin where, and this is the sin that's most insidious, that the devil tempts Jesus with, which is the need for security. So Jesus is feeling possibly insecure about his truly being the Son of God. The devil tries to play into that, throw yourself off the temple to prove you're the Son of God, and he doesn't do it because he is secure.
Okay, that's a nice example. This is a sort of typical case, but some temptations, like those posed to Jesus in the wilderness, are not exactly like this. It's not that brings about immediate pleasure. So can we think about any things that are temptations, but nevertheless aren't questions of immediate pleasurable sensations, but are something else? Yeah.
I was going to say, maybe this isn't quite what he was getting at, but you gain something that you usually haven't had before. So, for example, we want that donut, we would gain that donut, but the right thing to do would be to resist the donut. It's not flip, it's not, well, we really should have the donut, but we're going to do the wrong thing and resist it. It's always having something to do with gaining something you don't have already.
Ah, yes, so this does involve gaining, and indeed the examples in the wilderness are like this. Gain worldly power. You want to help the poor, turn stones into bread. That way you can help the poor, and so on. And so, notice, typically this is a gain for yourself, but it doesn't have to be. You could face a temptation for somebody else. You've got a child, let's say, that's desperately ill and needs some kind of operation, and you don't have the money. But then you have the chance to embezzle it. And it's not really for you, it's for the sake of the child. Yeah?
The moral problem comes in, dilemma comes in when you take something that's potentially someone else's. I mean, you take something that's just there, it's okay, but...
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, are these all examples of taking something? I mean, the fritter, maybe apple fritter. Yes, somebody else had that. But on the other hand, they were offering this week. They bought a bunch of them to bring back for me. Right? So it's not as if I'm stealing the apple fritter. That would be different. I mean, I could be tempted in that way, passing by the bakery and there are apple fritters. Oh, that would be good. As usual, I have no money. And so I just reach in when somebody's distracted and grab one. That seems very different from somebody coming in and saying, hey, I got apple fritters for everybody. Want one? And saying yes. So I agree that sometimes it's taken from others, but it doesn't have to be. Yeah.
In going on that point about it doesn't have to be taking or actually stealing, it doesn't have to be a grave sin. Doing the correct thing, but doing it the wrong way, contrary to good or contrary to God's will. So, for example, Jesus had the right as the Son of God, he had the power to turn the stones into bread. He chose not to do so. Later the angels waited on him because he persevered. Sometimes our sins are more actually going towards the good and going towards self-sacrifice, but without that key element of divine guidance.
Okay, that's a very interesting example. Aristotle, when he's talking about the nature of virtue, says it's doing the right thing in the right way, at the right time, for the right object, and for the right reason. And so you might think, wait, typically, in a case of temptation, giving in to temptation, I'm doing something that's the wrong thing, right? But what if it's not the wrong thing? It's just directed toward the wrong object, or it's done the wrong way, or for the wrong reason. Let's think about each of those in turn. What would be an example of something that is okay in itself, but is wrong because it's directed toward the wrong object?
Yeah, beer.
Beer! Say more. Wait, wrong object, beer? I'm having trouble computing that.
So like, according to the Gospels, I think that getting drunk and drunkenness and all that is a sin, very wrong. But then beer, tasting it by itself, not getting drunk or anything, is a very good thing. So looking at that and participating, in an activity that has to do with that, if you're just focused on, pleasing God and enjoying His gifts, beer, and not focused on getting drunk, escaping reality, things like that.
Okay, yeah, you might think, look, drinking beer, that's not itself bad. Well, drinking a lot of beer might be bad, right? So that would be a question of doing something that isn't by itself wrong, but doing it the wrong way, right? Drinking heavily might be different from just having a drink, and so you might think it's not the thing. Now, you might think there's something wrong with it, period, or you might think, oh, there's something wrong with binge drinking. But assuming that you think, oh, a beer or two is okay, but binge drinking is bad, then that would be an example of something that could be, it's not that you're doing the wrong thing, you're just doing it the wrong way, you're doing it too much. Yeah.
Loving your neighbor, but having it turn out that your neighbor's kind of like
okay, yes, loving your neighbor, right. Yeah, there are some things in the Gospels, I must admit, that I don't fully understand. One of them is the case where Jesus is talking about loving those who persecute you, loving your enemies, and he says, and in loving them, and in turning the nastiness they bring toward you around and repaying with kindness, it would be as if you're putting burning coals upon their head. And I think, whoa, if I'm doing this out of a good-hearted nature, it's like, I know you're insulting me, but I'm not going to repay you in kind, I'm going to be kind back. That might be a very good thing, but if I really do it because I think, here's how to really get you, I'm going to pour burning coals on your head by being so nice, everybody will think you're the jerk. Then that might be doing the right thing, but maybe not entirely in the right way. Yeah.
Yeah. On that verse, there's some interpreted that he's just stating something as fact, that they won't be able. The best way to detain evil is to repay with good, because they, in their own conscience, won't be able to continue, because it will feel so dissonant that they'll eventually have to really neutralize, but not out of a malicious intent.
Right.
Another example would be Bonhoeffer's dilemma about whether to kill Hitler or not to save the German nation and to stop.
Okay. Ordinarily, yeah, murder is a bad thing, right? But maybe there's even a right way to murder.
And then Moses taps the rock, and the water comes out, when God had instructed him to go about getting water in a way.
Okay, yes. So those are examples of things being done perhaps in the wrong way. I think it's easy to get the intuition that, yeah, look, it's not that you're doing it so bad, it's just you're doing it in the wrong way. Maybe you're doing it for the wrong reason, right? You might be helping somebody else, but helping somebody else in order to glorify yourself, or in order to make yourself feel better, or to impress somebody else, and so on. And all of that would be doing the right thing, but for the wrong reason. Toward the wrong object, it's easy to imagine that, right? I mean, sexual desire might be a fine thing, but it depends on the object. Like thinking, whoa, yeah, this involves cheating on my wife, but she's awfully cute, or whatever. That's directing, a good impulse, but toward the wrong object. So in any case, all of these might be examples of things. The paradigm cases are like this, but maybe there are other cases where actually you give into the temptation to do the right thing, but for the wrong reason, or toward the wrong object, or in the wrong way. So those are complexities that we should keep in mind here. But let's focus on the main sort of thing and try to understand how it's even possible. There are really two questions that emerge in discussions of weakness of will. How is it possible, if it is at all? Some people will deny that it is. And the second one is how to overcome it. After all, assuming it's a bad thing to given a temptation. We want to find ways of fortifying ourselves and resisting temptation. That's called strength of will. How do you become strong-willed? And even better, perhaps, at Aristotle, for example, the virtuous person, he says, never feels the temptation at all. And so Christian thinkers differ about that particular idea, but in any case, we have to ask, both how is it possible, and how can we overcome it? By being strong-willed or perhaps even virtuous and not feeling the temptation in the first place. Now, there are a variety of answers that have been given before Paul. Paul does give us one of the classic statements of the problem of weakness of will in Romans. Let me see if I can find the passage. I'm going to mark it here. Let's see. Yes. Okay. We know that the law is spiritual, but I am not. I am unspiritual, a virtuous slave of sin. I do not even acknowledge my own actions as mine. For what I do is not what I want to do, but what I detest. But if what I do is against my will, it means that I agree with the law, and I hold it to be admirable. But as things are, it is no longer I who perform the action, but sin that lodges in me. That's something that we're going to read reactions to again and again. Look, it's not I who sin, it's the sin that dwells within me. He's basically saying, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. I was trying to do the right thing, right? But somehow I ended up being weak of will. And so he says, for I know that nothing good lodges in me, in my unspiritual nature, I mean. For though the will to do good is there, the deed is not. The good I want to do, I fail to do. But what I do is the wrong, which is against my will. And if what I do is against my will, clearly it is no longer I who am the agent, but sin that is lodging in me. Now, in order to appreciate, I think, what he's saying, and it really is a sort of new take on this problem, we have to look at the background in Greek thought that lies behind it. There are different views, and he's responding to these and in a way giving a new twist to what is by now an old story. The first person I want to look at is Socrates. Socrates has a view on these questions. It's something that emerges in a number of the dialogues, the Meno, the Laches, the Charmides, a variety of other of the early dialogues that are focused on virtues of particular kinds. And he's thinking about this sort of problem and whether or not it's possible to have weakness of will. Now, Socrates in these early dialogues never actually puts forward a position. Socrates didn't write anything down. He doesn't argue in favor of anything. Nevertheless, he critiques other positions in a certain characteristic way, and a way that strongly suggests that he does hold certain principles in the background. Principles which later Aristotle very directly attributes to him and says, look, Socrates held it, blah, 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 blah. And so, since Socrates taught Plato and Plato taught Aristotle, we can assume that there's a kind of transmission, in addition to the dialogues there, about what Socrates really thought in the background. Now, what did he think? Well, there are several theses he holds. One is the thesis of the commensurability of value. What do I mean by that? I mean he thinks that all values can be compared on a single scale. All goods are really comparable to one another. So the idea is basically this. I'm trying to compare the good of long-term health as opposed to the immediate pleasure of the apple fritter. And those can be compared, okay? Those can be put on a single scale. Now, one view is, no, they can't. That's the problem, right? I don't know how to compare them. There's this good immediate yumminess, and then there's this more long-term thing, and I'm having trouble making which is better, really. That long-term health, being thinner, etc., or the immediate pleasure. Difficult to make those comparisons. Maybe there's no way. Socrates says, no, there is, of course, a way. And in fact, that's already implicit in the problem when we say it's going the better and doing worse. We're assuming, really, that we can make that kind of comparison. And indeed, he thinks that in general, we can take these two values and make choices. We make comparisons. That's what life is all about. It's about making those choices, making those comparisons. The second thing he draws as a consequence of this, really, is the thesis of the unity of virtue. Now, what does that mean? Well, if all goods can really be compared, then virtue consists in choosing the better one. Suppose I offer you a deal. I say, here, I will give you $10, or I will give you $20. What would you choose? The 20, right? Why would you take the 10? It doesn't make any sense. It's rational to take the 20. That's the right thing to do. It's what you ought to do. And so from this point of view, why would you choose the 10? If they can be directly compared and this one's better, why would you ever select the one that's $10, the good that's $10, instead of the good that's $20? Is there any reason? Yeah.
Taking more than you need.
Well, okay, maybe you don't want to take any more than you need. So you might be thinking, oh, look, I don't want to take more of your money. So perhaps it's like that. You think there's another good. In other words, that other person's good. And so that would be a way of saying, look, the 10 and 20, that's, it's not like your good is the only thing under consideration. Maybe there are other values. Yeah. Oh, good. Maybe you know that I need it more than you do. And so in that case, you don't want to take it. Is there anything else you could explain? Yeah.
Perhaps you feel undeserving. You think that he'll give that 20 to, so what he doesn't give you, he'll give to someone else.
Okay, maybe you think, look, if I don't select that other $10, then this will go to someone else. So all of those are ways of saying, look, maybe there is some additional value here that I'm not thinking about. But suppose there is no other value. Not to anyone. Yeah.
It's the immediacy. What if I tell you, I'm going to give you $10 or $20 next week?
Okay, good. It might be $10 now as opposed to $20 next year. That forces us to think about the time value of pleasures. Because we're the time value of goods. And that's a little bit complicated. There is an experiment that people have done, and they found that it's highly predictive of future success in all sorts of realms. I mean, financial success, educational achievement, just happiness levels, all sorts of other things. They take children when they're quite small, and they say, look, here's a marshmallow. You can eat it now, or you can wait, and I'll give you another marshmallow. And they make the child wait like 10 minutes, and if the child waits, they get an extra marshmallow, or maybe 2 extra marshmallows. Now, can the child, these are often kids who are like between 1 and 2 years old, okay? Which ones will wait, and which ones will consume the marshmallow and not be able to? Okay? It turns out the ability to wait, to defer gratification, and choose the higher good but later, ends up correlating highly with later success. I mean, you're all at the University of Texas at Austin, so almost certainly you were the kind of baby who would wait to get the extra marshmallow, okay? That's how you got here. You were able to defer gratification and work and plan and so on and so forth. But there are certain people who just say, what's the marshmallow now? Okay? And can't wait. And so that is part of what makes this hard, right? This is immediate and this is long term. And people have difficulty making that comparison. So here's Socrates' way of thinking about this. We've really got all the values on the scale. How would I ever choose the lesser? Well, maybe it's that, right? I'm miscomputing the value of waiting as opposed to the immediacy. Maybe I'm making a mistake, in other words, about judging the long-term good relative to the short-term good. Or maybe I just don't know what the values are, right? I might be ignorant of that. After all, if I say, here's $10, here's $20, that's an easy choice. But suppose I say, I have 2 envelopes, the red envelope and the blue envelope. Which will you choose, right? And I will tell you what's inside. You might choose the lesser because you don't know. There was as I was growing up, a TV show involving Monty Hall, Let's Make a Deal, where you would choose these things and, okay, behind the curtain, what is your, it's a brand new Chrysler. And then, now, when you trade that brand new Chrysler for what's behind, in box number 3. And, behind one of these is a fabulous prize, like an all-expense paid vacation to Hawaii. Behind the other one is something ridiculous, like goat or something, okay? And so, then people are put on the spot. Well, suppose you choose the one that turns out the goat. What? Give a brand new one for a goat? Well, I didn't know that I was choosing the goat, right? It would be a lot easier, a lot more boring if you just said, okay, you can choose between a goat, an all-expense paid vacation to Hawaii, or a new car. So, you might just be ignorant. Now, that brings us to the third thesis, which is that weakness of will is really impossible. Why are all the virtues the same? All the goods are comparable. And so, really, virtue, for Socrates, is equal to knowledge. It's just the knowledge of what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. Okay? It's knowing what's better and what's worse. But look, if I know what's better, of course I'm going to choose it. It would be irrational to choose otherwise. If I tell you, look, there is no other value under consideration, you can either have a 10 or a 20, and to say, oh, I'll just take the 10, that's just irrational. Okay? There's nothing else on the other side of the scale. So it follows from all of this that weakness of will is, from one point of view, impossible. There's nobody who's really weak of will. Nobody knows the better and does the worse. If you do the worse, it's because you don't know the better. Okay? So it's really just, in the end, ignorance. It's not knowing what you ought to do. But there's no such thing as knowing what you ought to do and not doing it. He said that would just be blind irrationality. Now maybe that's possible, but if it's possible, it is irrational. It's a kind of illness. It is not something that can really be treated through the mechanisms of philosophy. So that's his idea. There's really no such thing. Now what's the cure? Basically we want to ask, well, how is it possible? He says, well, really it's not. What looks like it, what involves giving into temptation, that's really just ignorance. Making a mistake about computing the relative values of these goods. And his point is, look, we do that all the time. Since that is the longer-term knowledge, this is generally an immediate good. It's very easy to make those mistakes. So he thinks, well, people are bad at this. We're just bad at making those short-term versus long-term judgments, and there's a lot of ignorance involved. Okay, now, how do we overcome it? Well, if weakness of will is really impossible, if vice is ignorance, then how do we overcome it? What's the cure? Knowledge, exactly. So the cure is just knowledge. We need to teach people to be better judges of, for example, the short term versus the long term. We need to teach people better what really is the ultimate good. And so that's what Socrates sees himself as doing, going around and bringing knowledge to people. Or at least convincing them that they're ignorant. It reminds me of Bertrand Russell, who once said, the point of a logic course should be to teach people not to think, because they're all certain to do it badly. So Socrates is in effect saying, look, I'm going to teach you not to make claims of knowledge because you almost always are wrong, you don't really know what you're talking about. He wants to push you toward a greater quest for knowledge, but I've got to admit, in these early dialogues, there isn't much ground for optimism about that. Nobody ever, in the end, knows what's going on. Yeah?
How can we determine what is the greatest good? Given there's one, assuming that there's one set of morals for everything, given there is a right and wrong answer for everything, how in one case do we determine that?
How do we determine that? Good question, right? If virtue is unified, it's always a question of knowing what to do and what not to do, knowing good and evil, as he often puts it in the dialogues. And really, all values can be compared, so it's a question of knowing how to do the comparison, how to put them on this scale. The main thing, if this is the problem, really, making these immediate versus long-term judgments, then actually that's the main thing we have to get better at. So if you want to know, well, how do you actually do this? How do you gain the relevant knowledge? Then you would think the best thing is to try to think about those short-term versus long-term decisions and figure out when it's worth waiting for that extra marshmallow and when it's not. I mean, sometimes, as in the experiment with kids, presumably it's supposed to be worth it to wait. But I can imagine a scenario where it's really not. Somebody says, look, I'll give you 10 marshmallows now, and if you don't eat them, I'll give you 11 next week. You have to wait a whole week, and you only get one extra marshmallow. You might think, then, quite rationally, I'll eat the 10 now. And so, really, those comparisons aren't that obvious. It's not, to use a financial term, it's not that obvious what the discount rate on pleasures is, right, or goods in general. We sort of have a rough idea of what it is with money, depending on interest rates. What's the interest rate on moral good, or on health or something? I have no idea. But presumably, there's some kind of comparison we do. We do prefer an immediate pleasure to a more distant pleasure. But that's not to say we don't defer gratification for greater pleasures later. How we make those judgments seems to be a hard question. Yeah?
Well, I think even if we got more marshmallows a week later, we still spend a week thinking about a couple of marshmallows. I mean, that's a lot of time to spend occupying your mind with marshmallows.
Okay, good. And you know, it's very interesting to watch these kids. Some of these experiments have been filmed, and you see the little kids look at the marshmallows, and they try to distract themselves. They're like, oh my God. And indeed, you know, the whole time they're waiting, they're thinking about marshmallows. So indeed, that's something that might be, look, it's just eat the apple fritter now, okay? So you won't spend a week thinking about the apple fritter. There are people who give up things in Lent. And, you know, sometimes people find that's pretty easy after the first week or two, and other times they spend the entire 40 days thinking about that, okay? And so that's, you know, the people who are really successful at this are the ones who can just put the marshmallows out of their mind. The kids who keep thinking about the marshmallows and keep going back to them, they find it really tough. And then there are the kids who are so consumed by the marshmallow presence that they just eat it right away. But you're right, I mean, there can be a cost for a certain kind of person because the whole time you're thinking about marshmallows. Yeah.
It also presupposes that you have faith that the future is going to be stable. It could be the case that you die in that week. And
That's
I
right.
was going to say, I guess that's, I don't know what you think about this, more of a historical question, but about the kind of emphasis on immediacy of the Epicureans and the Stoics. Like, if they're living during a time period when there's a societal decline, they might feel like, well, we plan for the future, but there's no hope anyway, so, I'm just saying.
Okay, very good. Your attitude about the future is crucial to this. And you might think, really, in terms of knowing how to do the short-term versus long-term comparisons, that stuff is really important. Suppose you're 96 years old, and you're in the hospital, and somebody brings you a marshmallow. They say, you don't eat it. I'll bring you a second one tomorrow. It's a cruel kind of experiment. But you might think, look, I'm eating it today. I don't know if I'll even be here tomorrow, right? And think about wartime. People who are actually in combat, do they tend to think a lot about the future? They're often given devices that are, in fact, for example, in Vietnam, a large number of soldiers ended up becoming addicted to heroin, partly because who knows if you're going to have a future, right? So the future cost is something that seems minor. On the other hand, almost all of those people, as soon as they got back to the United States, were able to quit the habit pretty quickly. Why? Because suddenly there's a future, okay, and the comparisons change. And so the probability of a future and how likely, that you might say the benefit is the next time, all of that's going to matter. If you're young, in fact, given my age, I'm a little bit afraid to say this, but you notice people investing a lot in education, in learning them, becoming smarter and wiser and so on when they're young. When they're older, it's much harder to find people who are actually doing that. And why? You might say, because there's less of a future payoff, right? You might think, yeah, I'm saving my marshmallows now for marshmallows later. But in your case, you can look forward to, gosh, what, 50, 60, 70 more years of marshmallows paying off for this? Whereas at my age, you might think, well, it's certainly not 50 or 60 or 70, I don't know what it is, but it's less. And so people invest less in their own development of talents, in education, and other things as they get older. So anyway, you're absolutely right. That kind of thing matters a lot. Now, Plato comes along and says, look, this isn't the right picture of it. Why? Well, partly he's saying, look, there really is such a thing as weakness. But he says also there's something that Socrates is not capturing. Suppose you are facing temptation. You're on a diet and somebody brings you an apple fritter or whatever is especially good temptation. Or, let's say you're trying to be faithful to someone during a long-term absence, and then there's this opportunity right in front of you. Or, let's say that, what's our other example? The work and the Super Bowl. Yes, you really have a lot to do, but on the other hand, your favorite team, let's say, is playing, you really want to watch, and so on, people fight you over at the party. And so, in all of those cases, is it just a question of thinking, well, let me look inside the envelopes and see which is more? Does it feel like that? Is it just like, well, I'll just see what is the greater good and choose it? The end. No, Plato says, you're at war with yourself. This is difficult, right? When you're facing temptation, what is that like? What is the experience of it like? It's difficult, right? I mean, you face conflict. You've got this conflict within yourself. And so Plato says, look, if all of this comes down to, should I choose the $10 or the $20, or it's free, 10 drachmas or 20 drachmas or whatever, then look, that's easy. But that's not the way it feels. It feels like a difficult thing. And it's not just difficult because it's like, ooh, I don't know what's in the envelopes. It's rather, you feel torn. One part of you, he thinks, really wants to go to the game or go watch the game. Another part of you wants to study. One part of you wants to be faithful, another part doesn't. One part of you really wants that apple fritter and so on. Now, what do I mean one part of it? Well, he says, look, they're really, in the end, have captured this idea of conflict, internal conflict, not just a conflict on different kinds of goods. He says, I have to think there are different parts of me. And so he says there are really three parts to the soul. One part, which ideally is in command, is reason. There is a rational part that is capable of making judgments about the relative goods at stake. But that's not it. If it were just like that, it really would be like, oh, wait, should I choose this envelope or that envelope? He says, but there are other factors. One of them is appetite. Or, to put it differently, design. And so it's easy to imagine conflicts between reason and desire. Reason tells me it is better to work and prepare for class the next day. Desire says, watch the game. Reason says, be faithful. Desire says, no. Reason says, lose weight. Appetite says, but an apple frick. Okay? So there's a very direct conflict here. Now, you might just leave it there, but Plato doesn't. Plato says there's another thing to consider. And he tells this story, a disgusting story. Actually, it's someone crossing a battlefield after a battle and finding himself torn, wanting to look at the dead bodies, but also being grossed out by it. Okay? And so he's feeling torn and finally goes over a dead body, opens his eyes and says, all right, look at it, you bastard. No. Speaking his eyes. Now he says, look, that's not to be understood really in terms of just desire. There's something else going on there. And it's not really reason at stake at all. Okay? It's really a question of what he refers to as the spirited element of the soul, or what we could think of, I think, reasonably as emotion. And he says there can be conflicts like that too. Now, usually he thinks reason and emotion are allied together. That emotion is a kind of primitive reason. But desire and emotion can come into conflict. Examples. When does desire conflict with emotion? Yeah.
In your example of faithfulness, your desire, your emotion says, I'm faithful to this person, that she's above my life, but your desire is an immediate.
Good, because exactly, desire for one person in that case versus love for another. So that can be an example of something that is a conflict. And you might say reason directly has something to do with that. Yeah.
Guilt.
Guilt, okay, good. You might have guilt come into conflict, either with reason. Perhaps reason is saying, look, that's all you could do. You had no choice, don't feel guilty. But nevertheless, you feel the emotion. Or it could be this kind of conflict, where you desire something, but also then you feel guilty for pursuing it. And so those kinds of conflicts are certainly possible. So Plato gives you this. Now, is weakness of will possible? Yes. And how is it so? Well, reason is the one that's judging what's better than what. And now, it's not just that it can sometimes make mistakes. Yes, it can. But even when it's getting it right, it can be overcome by desire or emotion. It might be that you know what the better thing to do is, but your desire for the apple fruit overcomes reason. Or the emotion of love or of guilt or whatever it is, anger, can overcome what reason directs. Yeah?
I kind of have a difficult question. In your opinion, what is closer to belief, desire or emotion? Or are they both forms?
I don't know, but Plato thinks these are much closer to beliefs. And so that he thinks there's a natural alliance between reason and spirit. That is, in fact, in one place, he gives an image of a charioteer with 2 horses. And this is the wild and unruly horse, really not very tamed, whereas this is the relatively tame and noble horse that generally pulls in the right direction, but of course can be corrupted by this other bad horse next to it. I shouldn't say bad horse, but just wild horse. Horse that is very difficult. Yeah.
Desire then be a form of justification?
Can desire be a form of justification? Okay, good. There are a lot of reasons why later thinkers have been troubled by the Platonic picture. We're going to end up drawing that on the blackboard quite a few times and then looking at what people do with it. But yeah, one thing you might do is to say, wait a minute. Why does reason have to be the boss? For example, somebody said, I go to this Super Bowl party, right? I've given in on the first temptation, and aha, there's hummus, and there is this chili con queso dip. And then somebody makes all this super cheesy chicken. And then over there is, the big bowl of chips and salsa and guacamole, and over here is blah, 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 blah. And I think, oh my gosh, what should I do? And now I've got a different kind of conflict. I've sort of given up on the reason and diet and debate. And now it's like, ooh, maybe I've got, well actually, this is getting at ourselves. Maybe I've got different appetites, different desires that come into conflict with each other. Do I want the guacamole and the queso and the bean dip and the blah, 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 right? Or maybe this comes and I start piling up my plate and I realize, oh, this is embarrassing. Okay, and so emotion enters into the picture. And so far, it's not like reason is directly, so yeah, I think often, you might say, in ordinary life, we face problems that are actually more at this level than the level of reason. Now, it might be that the more interesting ones involve reason, but you're absolutely right that a lot of stuff happens just out of this level. Yeah?
Can you use your reason to like justify that behavior though? Like be like, well, I can pay out on Sunday and then Monday I'll go to the gym and I'll start eating.
Yes. Okay, good. In fact, I've noticed that when people are really smart, they tend to actually be able to rationalize. Reason is highly active, and reason can say, well, yeah, I can go to the gym tomorrow. Then tomorrow's really busy. Well, that's fine, I'll go Tuesday. Right? There's always some justification. And in fact, sometimes I feel guilty teaching ethics, because I think what ethics, as it's sometimes taught anyway, teaches people to do is, look, there's a way of rationalizing anything. You get angry with somebody and you want to kill them, oh, there's probably some philosopher who says it's okay. And so, I think that's a very bad way of teaching ethics and thinking about it, but nevertheless, you can think, oh, what philosophy does is equip you with reasons to justify anything after the fact. And if that's what you think, philosophy is a very, very bad thing. And certainly sometimes that happens, in a sense, the history of the 20th century is the history of people using reason to justify all sorts of things that are absolutely monstrous. And you might say an uncorrupted reason or common sense, you would say, no, of course you can't do that. But people can find rationales for doing almost anything. Okay, anyway, we're running low on time, so I haven't yet told you what happens with Aristotle, but I'll do it super fast because it will get us right back to Paul. Aristotle looks at this picture and says, yes, a huge amount happens down at this level. At the level of emotion, the level of desire. And it's complicated. Emotions can conflict with desires. Emotions can conflict with emotions. What's an example of an emotion doing a conflict with another emotion?
When you want to watch the Super Bowl, but you don't want to do your homework. Or when you don't want to, when you have to do your homework, like you want to do your homework to stay ahead, but you don't.
Yes. All right, good. In fact, almost all of these things really end up involving that kind of conflict, right? You actually you're going to feel guilty if you just watch the game and don't do your homework, but nevertheless you want to. And but leave the want out of it. Just think, yeah, you're going to feel happy about getting to watch the game. You're going to feel unhappy, though, and guilty about not having it. So, yes, there's a conflict in this case. Almost always, you're going to have not only reason versus emotion, but there will be conflicts among the emotions. There will be conflicts among desires. You'll want to watch the game, but also to do your homework. Yeah?
You have a friend that recently, or you have a roommate that recently got accepted into med school, and you're happy for him, but you're kind of jealous at the same time because you're still stuck in the philosophy department.
Okay, good. Your friend gets into med school, you have this other notion, oh, all right, good for you, but then you think, why am I wasting my life doing what I'm doing? Yes, so there are these, anyway, Aristotle says, look, lump all that stuff together. It's complicated, there's a lot to be said about it, but this is, from his point of view, all involving the irrational part of the soul. So just distinguish the rational from the irrational part. That's the distinction that matters. It's not that this isn't important and that lots of things aren't going on. They are. But from the point of view of weakness of will, you might say, look, unless reason says this is what you ought to do, we're really not dealing with weakness of will at all. We're dealing with other kinds of conflicts. So put that off the table for the moment. Lots of interesting stuff there, but that's not really relevant to this, say. No. He begins his discussion by saying, yeah, I've got to really put this fast, so 20 seconds or less. Aristotle's book 6 and 7 of the Commensurability. Really, it comes down to this. He starts out by saying, look, it's obvious that Socrates is wrong, right? I mean, come on. There is such thing as weakness of will. People do give in the temptation, in conflict with the plain facts. But by the end, he says, in a sense, he's right. Because what does it mean? What happens when I say, it is better for me not to eat that fritter, but then I do it? He says, I am like one who's mad or drunk or asleep. In one sense, I know, I think, as I'm eating the fritter, I really want to watch my calories. Okay? I might say the words, he says, I'm doing it as an actor on a stage. I am not really believing it at the time. And so, at the time, I don't really know. There is a kind of knowledge that you have in the background of your mind, but there's a kind of knowledge that is active and you're actively thinking about believing it right at the time. And he says, you may know in this background sense, this potential sense, you do not know in the sense of full actuality. So, in the end, he says, actually, Socrates is in a sense right. In one sense, you know, in another, you don't. And so, in one sense, you know, and in that sense, yeah, there's a problem, but in another, you don't, and there Socrates is absolutely right. Now, since we have 1 minute left, what does Paul do? Well, Paul is saying something very interesting. He is accepting this distinction. Basically, there is a twofold distinction, okay? So Paul's version is like Aristotle. Paul is saying, right, there is a difference between these two parts. But what are the two parts? This, he groups together as the flesh, okay? So Paul here, yeah, this is all the flesh, okay? It doesn't really know. In fact, it's full of all of this stuff, right? Emotions, desires, various things that push me in all sorts of directions. Some good, some bad. It is something over which I don't have much control. Now, Plato would say, how do I solve the problem? Make sure reason is in command. Aristotle, try to make sure your knowledge is really active. Paul says, I can't do it on my own. The fact is, the flesh is too powerful. This, he identifies with the spirit. But the problem is the spirit isn't powerful enough all by itself. So within our own human terms, he says, how is it possible? Oh, I can tell you how it's possible. The flesh here is very strong. Add together appetite, emotion, desire. This is very, very powerful. It's hard for reason to win out against that. But now notice, he says, what is my will? Where is my will? My will is up here. And so there's a sense in which, here's me, okay? Here is my will. I'm trying, but I'm overcome in the flesh. And so he wants to say, look, I'm trying to do the right thing. My heart is in the right place. My reason is directing me correctly, but it is too weak. And so he takes this metaphor of weakness of will very seriously. The spirit is there, but it is weak. It is willing the right thing, but nevertheless it is failing. Now, next time we'll consider the question, well, if I am incapable of overcoming this on my own, how can I do it? That's what he thinks he has an answer for, a distinctive answer, and that will throw us back to this